And so once I got that done, you can see I've kind of got this arced diamond under there in the valley. Now I got to do that theme and get this fender and oil tank mounted together. With those rubber mounts, which you definitely want to have insulators on a lot of your stuff, especially oil tanks. Rigid mounting stuff tends to break, especially if it's floating in space like an oil tank. So I got to make a third mount that goes underneath this oil tank and a center mount for the lower part of the rear fender. And I decided, well, they're both in the same place, so they might as well go together. So now we're just wrapping up this fender, covering up every little bit of paint because this shit looks beautiful and I don't want to be the asshole to fuck it up. I got to do a decent amount of fabrication, cutting, tack welding all around this thing. So I'm not leaving anything to chance. Blue painter's tape is actually phenomenal at like bouncing welding sparks off of it. So I like using it over like this type of tape gets stuck to it, can kind of fuck the clear coat up. I'd rather err on the side of saving the paint and just be a little bit more careful around it than doing anything too crazy. I can't afford that nice plastic wrap. So take your 530 chain, throw it on the tire. Oldest trick in the book, works really well. Gives you a tight fender gap with plenty of room for rocks and other road debris to slide up there, have access to mounting hardware, that kind of stuff. It's pretty much the sweet spot for serviceability and a nice custom look. Probably the longest process that I was kind of blown away by when I started building bikes professionally was the time it takes to center a rear wheel and fender. Even with bolt-on aftermarket stuff, doing wider rear tires, those kind of things, it is a long process of getting everything centered perfectly. There's a lot of stuff you got to kind of pay attention to. The squish inside the rear swing arm axle area, the offset of the frame. This frame actually has a pretty big offset on it, which wasn't really necessary for this bike since we're running a stock rear wheel, nice narrow 16. But yeah, this process is everything. If you get your fender off a little bit, you could spend all the money in the world on paint and sweet accessories, but if that shit isn't in the center, it's amateur as fuck. So yeah, spending a lot of time trying to find center to get the first mount, which is kind of where the fender mount and the oil tank mount meet the frame. I decided I wanted to kind of hide it up under the seat rather than going down to the lower part of the frame or anywhere near the transmission. This way, you don't got to worry about the transmission running into it. Keeps it simple as far as future planning. There's definitely a lot of decisions you'll make where you think this is a cool spot to put something, and then later on, as you start mounting more stuff in there, you realize shit's in the way now. So kind of always have that forethought about what else you need to put on the bike, what goes in the area. Try to hide stuff in logical places, but also don't make it too hard for yourself to work on it. I've worked on a lot of molded bikes and really custom stuff, and holy shit, is it a nightmare to work on and fix when shit goes wrong. This is going to be a rider. This isn't going to be something that just sits in the garage all summer and goes to like 2 or 3 shows. It's got to work. So got that top mount welded to the frame. Now I'm moving on to making the oil tank mount first. I kind of figured this one would make the most sense to do. Once it's rigid, I will build the fender mount to this. Order of operations is kind of important. What you have access to at what point, welder handles, TIG handles, all that stuff is a certain size. And trying to fish that shit in to get a decent weld is going to be kind of a nightmare. Definitely eyeballing a lot of this stuff in square, taking measurements, but then kind of finessing it to where it looks right. Sometimes going perfect on a level or a gauge isn't always the best decision. I've built a few bikes where, you know, it's a mostly stock bike and we're adding in a certain component and something's not looking right. You got to make it look right ultimately. Unless it's something in the drivetrain, squareness isn't really critical other than it should look square. So that's what was going on here. So you can kind of see that arced piece. There's a little kind of a donkey dick hanging off the end of it. That's going to get taken care of later. I was like, I don't want to be taking stuff in and out while it's tacked. I want to keep it all in place. Try not to let things bend out of way too much. So now fish mouthing this piece, trying to get it really tight in there. I've got this fender kind of locked down by wedging a bunch of metal in it. It was a huge pain in the ass to get this fender to stay put exactly where I wanted it. It was kind of twisted. It's made for an 18-inch wheel, so the arc doesn't really follow the wheel and tire radius too well. There's a lot of stuff you got to kind of deal with, and you can see there I'm kind of tweaking the fender again before I get it tacked in place. Kind of letting things grow, and then you tack them on the opposite side to get them to shrink in. Happy with where it is, so now I'm just going to send home some fat tacks so that I can take stuff out and it won't move. Yeah, a lot of this stuff, it's hard to explain in a fast-forwarded video. Takes years to kind of figure out some of these tricks, but at the same time, a lot of it is just do it. You're going to learn from those mistakes you make. Be willing to start over when something isn't working. There were a lot of plans for this bike that I bailed on just because I knew I wasn't going to have the time, didn't have the tools. Work with what you got. It's going to look a lot better when you're done. So now these holes for the fender struts, I don't remember what size they were, but they were kind of a weird size for what I wanted to do. And knowing how paint crushes down when you are bolting the hardware to your frame, I wanted to put some brass inserts in this so that when things got bolted down real snug, the powder coat wasn't going to get crushed and cracked if and when I should say this fender is going to be pulled off. Rear fenders get pulled off all the time to the shops. A lot of times it's just to protect the paint. That's why we pulled them at LaFour's, was get them out of the way so you're not dropping tools on them, anything like that. Padded blankets are great, but keeping shit out of the way completely is better. Wanted this bike to be able to be worked on, not just, you know, thrown together and just deteriorates because you can't service it. Took quite a bit of time to kind of get these things pressed into the frame, and then just going to shave them down so they're flush with the frame, and I can use a little stepped washer to kind of keep everything off the paint. Oh, excuse me. Jesus. So yeah, moving on to the actual sissy bar. Big thing I asked Brad on this was if he planned on ever having a passenger or ever carrying like a pack to go to campouts, and he said no, which was a huge relief because I really didn't have a good way of supporting this fender in a way that could really take any weight. There wasn't really, I would have had to raise this fender a lot to put a support under it. There's no way to do struts in a way that wouldn't look goofy as fuck. So thankfully we were doing mostly just a fender mount. That's all this needed to do, which gave me the freedom to kind of do something that was really specific to the theme, keeping with those same ring rolled arches. Originally I was hoping I could just run one piece of material on each side and have them converge in a nice pointy sissy bar. But the geometry didn't really allow for that. Between the offset and the way the bungs needed to be supported, I figured out a way I could kind of make it look like it was one piece by running the struts just in front of the bungs. But there actually ended up being two pieces, so I could lean the upper part of the sissy bar in enough and then have the struts on the outside kind of clear the chain. That's the big thing on the other side. When you have an offset frame, your sissy bar is never going to be perfectly square left and right. One side's got to be out a little more. And again, you're coming back to that same thing where you're trying to make it look like it's even or square to the other side. If you were to actually measure it, it's going to be way off. But if it's doing its job and it looks square, that's the goal. You're not going to be able to have both sides of that coin. So just starting with the lower struts, these are the structural ones. These are doing all the work. So making sure those are in a place that the welds aren't really going to be doing a lot of work, that, you know, if any weight is pushed on this, shit isn't just going to come apart. I really pride myself on making things that are structurally sound. They're not just aesthetic looking pieces. Like, yeah, they got to look good, but first and foremost, they got to work. So, and here I am probably just explaining exactly what I'm talking about. Don't ever ask me questions unless you've got like an hour to spare, because once it fucking starts rolling, I can't shut it off. And I'm not aware that I'm being an asshole, so. But yeah, once I got those lower struts welded in place, now I can work on the top of the sissy bar. This is another huge point of how you tie everything together, and I will stand by this, that your sissy bar, your handlebars, your exhaust, those are going to be the things that are calling attention. And if they feel like they're just taken out of a catalog and put on, your bike's just going to look like that. If you're trying to build something that is, you know, these born free bikes that win and things like that, it's because these guys pay attention to the details. They're looking at, what is my angle? You know, what does this thing look like it's doing when it's stationary? What does it look like it's doing when it's moving? And so I'm a big proponent of you match the backbone angle to the height of the bars. So basically you just parallel the angle of the backbone up to the top of the handlebars. That's how tall your sissy bar should be. Unless you have a reason to have a really tall one, like you do a lot of camping, that kind of stuff, where you've got a big tall sissy bar bag on there, or you like the look of a little stubby sissy bar, which is a tough look. For a mid-tall sissy bar, the perfect height is going to be just going like your bars are. That's exactly what you saw me doing there, kind of eyeballing it by hand, looking at about where it should be, and then confirming that with a ruler, measuring the height of the bars off the risers, and that kind of confirmed what I was seeing. I think it was like literally 12 inches. So I get my pieces cut up, and now I got to try to find where they come together, grind everything down so it comes to a unified point, tacking stuff together so I can work with it, and then kind of bending and tweaking it. I think this is about where I realized the bungs on the Fender were not in line. And it was one of those like, oh well, just got to keep going, get it tacked in place, start looking at it, give it a little tweak, give it a little bend, and yeah, just keep kind of finessing stuff in place. I think trusting your eye, looking at stuff a lot. I mean, the one thing, and why would anybody want to watch it, but for every hour I worked on this bike, I probably stared at it for 5. I'm not a big fan of just like doing. I'm a big fan of thinking and thinking and thinking until I feel like, all right, I've got the right idea. So now that that's all tacked and placed, putting the kickstand on, which is kind of the last major fabrication thing. If you've noticed, nothing is fully welded in at this point. Everything is tacked. A lot of that is because I am running out of time to get this thing to the powder coater. It is late in the winter, almost early spring, and I've got to have this thing done for the beginning of June. So I am like, I just need to make everything that I need the frame here for. I need to get it done and figured out. So that is why nothing's getting fully welded in right now, because it's kind of a waste of time in the overall process. But yeah, just trying to get that kickstand welded in and at a good lean. I think, the way your bike leans is a part of the look, but I was always taught like between 2 and 4 inches. If your kickstand's got a spring, usually 4 inches. Little bike like this, 2 to 3 is probably plenty. I think that's what I set it to. But yeah, I tried to kind of tuck it in the frame in a place that looked on purpose. But yeah, all the major fabrication is pretty much done at this point besides the welding. You can see there the sissy bar, trying to make it look like it's one continuous angle arc. And then the rear oil tank mount and fender mount. You can see the 3 points there, just a little dinky bracket. Real small, real subtle, keeping in theme with the engine mount. You can see all those bungs that I made on a lathe. Don't have the actual hardware in there, but trying to make it look like those two kind of diamondy arcs come together and flow. And then, yeah, this is going to be the first time I'm looking at the bike in like 4 months of working on it, getting it down on the ground. I would normally probably bring this thing down to the ground a lot more, but because it didn't have a sissy bar or didn't have a kickstand on it, kind of made it hard to do. The handlebars aren't even bolted in. So everything is still really mocked up as far as what position it's in. So now that I got the sissy bar, god damn it, at least I got the kickstand tacked in place and tacked. Like, I was wondering, like, is it actually going to hold up? Like, this bike right now probably weighs about 450, 500 pounds all in. But yeah, this is kind of the first smile moment you have when you're building a bike. I doubt myself every step of the way until I kind of get this far into a project. It just doesn't look right on the rack. But yeah, putting the regulator underneath the transmission, did it a lot at LaFour's. I think it's one of the simplest and cleanest places you can put it. It's easy to access. If and when they burn up, you can just change it. It's not like tucked under the tank, or the wires are hard to get to, especially doing internal wiring on this frame. As you can see, I'm marking out where I need to have holes to get wires through the frame. Wasn't going to do internal brake lines on this. That felt like a lot. I'm not a huge fan of the nylon brake lines. Plus, this is going to have a lot of braided hose on it, so braided brake lines are going to look just fine. So now, time to tear it down and finish cutting the frame up, drilling all those holes. So this is kind of the final teardown stage. Making sure that I don't need to put anything back in. Again, we're committed after this point.